The last stone teetered twice before settling into place. Holden Mercer threw his full weight behind the lever, driving it down as the wind roared across Red Hollow Basin, carrying the hard metallic taste of an oncoming storm. After 11 grueling weeks wrestling red stone, the horseshoe wall finally stood 8 feet tall, thick enough to defy the winter. Then came the sound. Crack, sharp, final. The sound of breaking. A fracture spiderwebbed across the top course of stone. The night's cold had already won, before the work was even finished. And at that exact moment, Benedict Shaw, the man who owned the valley, pulled his horse to a stop. His eyes swept over the unfinished work as he delivered his verdict. A stone wall won't feed a family through a Montana winter. There was no cruelty in his voice. That made it worse. As Shaw's silhouette faded, Holden stepped inside his wall. Outside, the wind still raged. Inside, the air was nearly still. He pressed his bleeding hand against the stone. It still held a faint trace of the day's warmth. Not much, but it was everything. Do you believe a flicker of warmth is enough to defy a Montana winter? That crack wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. To find out if this fracture becomes the foundation of their hope or its tombstone, hit follow and discover the story of Red Hollow. Spring reached Montana territory slowly in 1881. Not with warmth, not with softness. The snow simply loosened its grip a little at a time, until wagon wheels could move again through the basin roads. That was when Holden Mercer and his wife Elias arrived in Red Hollow Basin after nearly 6 years drifting between rail camps across Nebraska and the Dakota line. Holden had worked as a survey assistant for a freight route company, pushing supply roads farther north. Most men on those crews learned distances. Holden learned terrain. He noticed things other men ignored. Rock held heat longer than open soil after sunset. Snow melted first beside dark cliff walls. Wind changed character near canyon bends, splitting apart or folding back on itself depending on the shape of the land. He stored observations the way some men stored ammunition. Red Hollow Basin looked affordable for a reason. Benedict Shaw explained the property without embellishment when he walked them across the ground that first afternoon. The soil was alkaline, too much redstone close to the surface. Wind funneled hard through the basin once winter settled in. The growing season stayed short, even in good years. Most people in town believed the land was useful only for grazing thin cattle and disappointing hopeful settlers. Elias liked it immediately, not the ground itself. The cliff, a long wall of red sandstone, rose behind the dry gulch on the southeastern edge of the property. Late sunlight still clung to the stone, even after shadows had swallowed most of the valley floor. She stopped walking and looked at it for a long moment. "That rock's holding the day longer," she said quietly. By then, the air around them had already turned cold, but the cliff had not. Holden looked at the sandstone face glowing copper in the last light of evening, while the rest of Red Hollow Basin faded toward blue-gray darkness. He did not answer her. He simply remembered it. The first winter in Red Hollow Basin stripped away Holden Mercer's early confidence faster than he expected. The cabin survived, but the land did not cooperate. Cold winds crossed the basin at strange angles and froze the ground deeper than local farmers had warned. The Mercer garden failed almost immediately after the first hard freeze. Seed rows disappeared beneath ice-packed soil, while snow drifted unevenly around the red sandstone cliff behind the cabin. Most men in the valley blamed bad weather and moved on. Holden started watching patterns instead. He noticed snow melted faster near dark stone than open ground. Certain patches beside the cliff stayed softer after sunset. Gravel held warmth longer than pale soil once daylight disappeared. Then, one January morning, Elias stepped outside at dawn and found the cliff face still releasing faint warmth, while the rest of the basin remained locked beneath bitter cold. That moment stayed with Holden. Maybe survival in Montana was not about producing more heat. Maybe it was about learning where heat refused to die. When spring thaw finally arrived, most of their first planting failed in the frozen ground beneath the mud surface. Red Hollow saw failure. Holden saw a question that still had not been answered. By the end of that first failed season, Red Hollow Basin had already decided what Holden Mercer was. Not a farmer. Not a builder. A man dragging his wife towards starvation because he had become obsessed with stone and weather. Caleb Dunn, a cattle rancher known for speaking louder after whiskey, laughed openly outside the saloon one windy afternoon. Mercer's trying to grow supper out of canyon walls. The men around him laughed with the relief people often felt when somebody else failed first. Pastor Eli Cutter approached the matter differently. During Sunday sermon, he warned about men who mistake stubbornness for wisdom and confuse hardship with purpose. Nobody in Red Hollow missed the meaning. A few days later, Agnes Cutter, the pastor's wife, and one of the valley's strongest social voices, arrived at the Mercer cabin carrying fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Charity was the excuse. Inspection was the real reason. She studied the cracked walls, the stacked notebooks, the survey stakes outside. Then she asked Elias quietly if she truly intended to stay through another winter there. Elias never became defensive. Instead, she looked toward the north side of the basin and asked a question of her own. How long does snow stay against your north fence in February? Agnes frowned slightly. She did not understand, but Elias did. She had started noticing that snow never settled evenly. Wind shaped it, sun shaped it, stone shaped it. Outside town, Holden stood alone beside the red cliff face with strips of cloth tied to survey poles, watching the evening wind change direction along the canyon bend. Far behind him, laughter drifted faintly from the saloon. He never turned around. Holden Mercer spent the entire spring studying the land, the way other men studied livestock prices or weather reports. Every evening at sunset, he pressed the back of his hand against different sections of the red sandstone cliff and recorded temperatures in a leather ledger already stained with ash and dirt. Each morning before sunrise, he walked the basin, checking where snow still remained and where it vanished first. Patterns began to appear. The southeastern cliff face stayed warmer than the valley floor long after dark. Black gravel held radiant heat longer than pale-packed soil. Wind did not move in straight lines through Red Hollow Basin. It bent around obstacles, folded through narrow cuts, broke apart near curved surfaces. So Holden started building small tests. Low piles of dark gravel, shallow trenches beneath stone shelves. Thin muslin stretched over crude cedar frames and coated with boiled linseed oil to trap warmth. Some experiments worked for a while. One failed badly. After a wet freeze in late April, moisture condensed beneath a muslin frame during the night. By dawn, the inside had frozen solid. Every sprout beneath the cloth died under a thin layer of cloudy ice. Elias found Holden sitting beside the frame before sunrise. The dead shoots were still standing upright inside the frost. Most men would have kicked the structure apart. Holden did not touch it. He opened the leather ledger on his knee instead and wrote down outside temperature, wind direction, soil warmth, moisture depth, freeze time. Nature had corrected another assumption. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, Holden stopped treating failure like an insult and started treating it like information. Miriam Mercer, Holden's widowed mother from Iowa Bluff Country, arrived in Red Hollow Basin near the end of summer in 1882 aboard a freight wagon carrying flour sacks, mining tools, and 2 small cloth bundles filled with seeds. She brought frost beans from Iowa Bluff Country, cold hardy mustard greens, and 40 years of watching how winter moved across exposed farmland. Unlike Holden, Miriam did not begin with measurements. She touched things first: the soil, the gravel, the stone face behind the gulch. She stood still during wind shifts and watched dust move across the basin floor without speaking a word. For 2 days, she said almost nothing about Holden's plans. Then, on the third evening, she studied the row of stakes he had placed for the future wall and finally spoke. "The wall's wrong." Holden looked up sharply from the ledger in his lap. He thought she meant the entire idea. But Miriam shook her head and pointed toward the western side of the basin where the crosswinds narrowed before entering the property. "A straight wall will stack snow pressure right against your frames," she said. "Winter'll bury the warm ground you're trying to protect." She took a dead willow branch and drew directly in the dirt beside the cabin. Not a straight enclosure. A curve, wide at the center, narrow at the opening. Like a horseshoe, bent toward the southeast cliff. As she finished the last line, a gust rolled down from the foothills and split naturally around the shape she had traced in the dust. Elias noticed it first. Holden noticed a second later. Miriam said nothing more after that. She simply folded the seed cloth packets closed again while the evening wind curved exactly where she said it would. Benedict Shaw arrived at the Mercer cabin during the first week of autumn in 1883 carrying debt papers folded inside his coat. The overdue balance had reached the point where even Shaw's patience was thinning. "If the account isn't settled by March," he said flatly, "the homestead comes back to me." Holden never argued, never begged for more time. Instead, he looked toward the red sandstone cliff behind the cabin and asked one quiet question. "Have you ever stood against that cliff after sunset in January?" Shaw glanced once toward the rock face glowing dimly in the evening light, but he never answered. That night, the three Mercers spread every note across the kitchen table beneath a smoking oil lamp: wind charts, gravel temperatures, freeze records, sun maps, wall sketches curved, like a horseshoe. The numbers told the truth clearly enough. There was no realistic way to earn enough money before spring. Only one possibility remained. The land itself would have to produce food through winter. Outside, the first hard winds of approaching cold season began striking the cabin walls, while the cliff behind the house continued holding warmth long after the valley floor had turned dark. Work on the wall began 3 days later. Holden, Elias, and Miriam climbed the southeastern slope each morning before sunrise carrying old iron wedges, sledgehammers, and cottonwood levers cut from creek bottoms farther north. The sandstone broke unevenly. Some pieces split clean. Others shattered without warning and rolled back down the hillside through loose gravel and frost. They hauled each usable block with an aging mule named Brack, whose breath smoked white through the cold morning air. Rawhide runners beneath the stone sleds screamed across frozen ground every time the load shifted sideways. The enclosure slowly took shape below the cliff, not straight, curved, wide through the center where trapped air could settle. Narrow at the southeastern opening where sunlight entered during winter afternoons. The northwestern spine stayed thicker than the rest, to absorb the worst crosswinds blowing down from the Absaroka foothills. But winter fought every step of it. One section of retaining wall shifted nearly half an inch after a hard overnight freeze lifted the ground beneath the foundation stones. A crosswind storm created a snowdrift, exactly where Holden had planned to build the first growing frames. 3 nights later, the original gravel heatbed lost nearly all stored warmth after shifting winds stripped heat away faster than the stones could release it. Holden wanted to tear apart the entire western section and rebuild everything from the ground up. Miriam stopped him before dawn the next morning. "You don't fight winter head-on," she said. "You redirect it." So they adjusted instead of starting over. Low vent gaps near the wall base relieved pressure during wind bursts. Drainage trenches beneath the gravel stopped meltwater from freezing under the heat beds. Along the outer curve, Holden added short, jagged projections of stone Miriam called wind teeth to break apart clean airflow before it reached the enclosure center. The difference appeared slowly. One evening near dusk, Holden stepped inside the completed curve while wind hammered across the open basin outside. For the first time since arriving in Montana, the air around him did not strike straight through his coat. The wind moved around him instead. Once the wall stood complete, Holden Mercer stopped thinking like a homesteader and started thinking like a man testing a machine. Every evening after sunset, he carried thermometers into the enclosure and placed them carefully in different locations. One near the gravel beds, one against the sandstone face, one outside the wall in the open basin, where the wind still moved freely across the valley floor. Then he waited. The first readings changed everything. Inside the enclosure, temperatures stayed 8 to 11 degrees warmer than the exposed valley during the first hours after dark. Dark gravel released warmth slowly beneath the stone slabs. Even near midnight, the sandstone cliff continued giving back traces of the heat it had absorbed during the day. For the first time, Holden saw proof instead of theory. The enclosure was creating its own air pocket, not warm enough for comfort, but different. Different mattered. Then nature corrected him again. A wet freeze rolled through Red Hollow without warning after 2 mild afternoons. Snowmelt seeped beneath one section of gravel bed and became trapped overnight. By dawn, the moisture had frozen solid under the stones. The heat disappeared almost instantly from the entire eastern corner of the enclosure. Holden blamed the gravel depth at first, then the stone spacing. Elias noticed the real problem. During daylight, meltwater had been draining downhill beneath the gravel pocket. Once temperatures dropped, the water froze under the bed and pulled heat away faster than the stones could replace it. So the three of them dug narrow drainage trenches beneath the gravel layer, using trench blades Amos Pike had forged weeks earlier. The next night, the temperatures stabilized again. Late that evening, Holden sat alone inside the enclosure, with the ledger balanced on one knee. Outside the wall, the basin wind still carried sharp cold across the snowfields. Inside, the gravel beneath his boots continued releasing faint stored warmth into the darkness. Warm air alone could not grow food. Holden understood that before the first snow of November ever reached Red Hollow Basin, the enclosure could hold heat. The cliff could return warmth after sunset, but the soil inside still behaved like dead ground. So the three of them began hauling black silt from an old floodplain nearly a mile north of the homestead. Every load crossed frozen terrain. Buckets swung from hand poles across their shoulders, while Brack pulled heavier sled loads behind them through shallow snow and frozen grass. The black silt came from low bends, where spring runoff had settled for years before drying into dark, fertile layers beneath the surface crust. Back at the enclosure, they mixed it with ash compost from the stove pit, mule bedding, charred straw, broken organic matter scraped from creek edges. The work became slower every week. Food supplies tightened. Holden reduced the cornmeal portions without discussing it aloud. Beans soaked longer in water before cooking, because swollen beans filled the stomach better than dry ones. Nobody complained. One morning during the third hauling trip, Miriam stopped halfway across the basin. Not dramatically. She simply stood motionless in the wind, with both hands still gripping the carrying pole, while her breath moved in slow, white clouds through the cold. For several seconds, Holden thought she might collapse into the snow, but she did not. She adjusted her grip and kept walking. That was frontier endurance in its purest form. No speech, no self-pity, just movement, continuing after comfort had already ended. Weeks later, Elias turned over one section of newly mixed soil beneath the enclosure and paused. Steam rose faintly into the cold evening air. Then the smell reached her. Not ash, not rot. Living earth. Holden knelt beside her without speaking and pressed the soil between his fingers. Moisture remained trapped beneath the surface, instead of draining away into frozen ground. That night, he opened the leather ledger and wrote a single line beneath the temperature notes. Soil no longer smells dead. Holden brought the wagon spring iron to Amos Pike's smithy just after the first hard freeze locked the basin roads. The blacksmith studied the metal pieces, spread across the workbench, while forge heat rolled through the dim wooden shop in slow waves. Holden did not ask for ordinary farming tools. He wanted narrow trench blades for drainage cuts beneath gravel beds, shallow heat hose designed to move warm surface soil without exposing colder layers underneath, curved stone scrapers for shaping airflow channels between the enclosure walls. Amos listened carefully, even while suspicion stayed visible on his face. Most men in Red Hollow still believed Holden Mercer had lost practical sense somewhere between the cliff wall and the notebooks. But the tool designs themselves were difficult to dismiss. The shapes had purpose behind them. From the back room came the sound of coughing again. Lucy Pike stepped into the doorway, holding a blanket around her shoulders. The cough had lingered through most of autumn now. Long winters without fresh food had a way of draining strength from people slowly in frontier country. She looked at the drawings beside Amos's anvil. "I'd trade near anything," she said quietly, "for something green in February." The smithy fell silent after that. Amos picked up one of Holden's sketches again and turned it toward the forge light. Finally, he nodded once. "I'll make the tools," he said. "You bring me part of the first winter harvest." Outside the open smithy doors, loud laughter suddenly rolled across the frozen street. Caleb Dunn stood near the saloon porch, shaking his head. Mercer's fixing to feed his wife gravel and canyon rocks. Several men laughed with him. Inside the smithy, Holden never reacted. Amos simply lifted his hammer. A second later, iron struck the anvil hard enough to drown the laughter outside. The first sign appeared as a thin, uneven line beneath the southeastern cliff after a week of deep cold. Elias noticed it while carrying ash from the stove pit. Snow had melted there, not much. Only a narrow strip no wider than a boot heel, but the rest of the basin remained locked solid beneath hard white frost. Holden dug into the ground below the melt line before sunrise the next morning. Nothing. Only frozen shale and damp stone. For 3 more days he kept digging shallow test holes along the cliff base while the wind sharpened across Red Hollow Basin. Still no water. Then Miriam climbed down into the trench, looked once at the exposed layers, and shook her head. "Too high," she said. "Water hides deeper once the freeze settles." So Holden dug beneath the red shale shelf instead of through it. That was where they found it. A slow thaw seep moving silently under the rock face. Thin as twine. Barely enough to darken the stone beneath it, but moving. That mattered more than volume. The 3 of them built carefully after that. A narrow trench lined with flat stone, a shallow holding basin, an overflow channel to relieve freeze pressure during cold snaps. Then, winter struck the system again. One brutal overnight freeze locked the trench solid. Expanding ice split part of the clay seal near the basin edge and pushed water backward beneath the gravel beds. Holden stood over the damage near dawn, with both hands hanging useless at his sides. For the first time in months, the system looked close to collapse. Miriam crouched beside the broken section and pressed loose gravel into the base beneath the channel. "Hard clay breaks," she said calmly. "Flexible seams move." They rebuilt the trench with softer clay joints and gravel beneath the water path, so freeze pressure could shift without shattering the system apart. On the 5th morning after the repair, the temperature stayed below 0 again. But the water still moved. Only a thin silver thread beneath the snow. Elias dropped to one knee beside the basin and stared at it for a long moment, while white breath drifted around her face. Then she began to cry quietly. Not because the flow was strong, because it never stopped. Old Vera Bell arrived at the Mercer enclosure during the first week of December, while light snow drifted across the basin in slow, uneven ribbons. Most people in Red Hollow avoided the old widow when possible. She had spent years moving between abandoned mining camps north of the territory line, trading herbal remedies, seeds, and weather knowledge for supplies. Some called her strange. Others simply called her old. Vera stopped outside the stone gate without announcing herself. For several minutes, she said nothing. Her eyes moved slowly across the enclosure. The curved walls, the gravel heat beds, the muslin-growing frames darkened with oil, the narrow trench where water still flowed beneath the edge of forming ice. Finally, she looked toward Holden. "You're bending winter instead of fighting it." It was the first time anyone outside the Mercer family had understood the system immediately. From inside her coat, Vera removed several small cloth packets tied with faded cord. Miners' lettuce seeds from northern camps. Frost beans adapted to shallow, rocky soil. A bitter mustard strain miners once grew beside heated stone foundations near abandoned silver works. But she refused to hand them over right away. "Only if you write everything down," she said. Holden frowned slightly. Vera pointed toward the leather ledger resting near the enclosure wall. Methods, temperatures, failures, adjustments. All of it. The wind moved softly along the curved stone behind her. Knowledge dies faster than men out here. That sentence stayed with Holden long after she left the basin. Until then, the ledger had mostly been practical. Numbers, measurements, wind directions, freeze times. That night, something changed. He began recording why systems failed, why moisture trapped beneath gravel, why rigid clay cracked under freeze pressure, why curved walls redirected snow instead of collecting it. Not just results, understanding. By lantern light, Holden filled page after page while Elias carefully labeled the seed packets beside him. Outside, winter pressed harder against Red Hollow Basin. Inside the enclosure, forgotten knowledge had started growing roots again. Then came the cold that nearly ended everything. The temperature dropped to 24 below zero and stayed there for days. Crosswinds shifted unexpectedly through the basin and pushed snow against the southeastern opening of the enclosure. Sunlight exposure narrowed hour by hour beneath growing drifts. 2 cold frames failed completely. The muslin coverings froze stiff before dawn. Bitter mustard collapsed beneath the ice in dark flattened rows. Even the gravel beds began losing stored warmth faster than the stone could replace it. For the first time since building the enclosure, Holden Mercer stopped believing the system would survive. Late one night, he sat beside the dying stove fire and quietly considered selling the homestead back to Benedict Shaw in spring. Hired labor on freight routes suddenly sounded easier than another winter of failure. Elias never argued with him. She only listened. Across the dark cabin, Miriam lay awake beneath blankets, reciting information from memory into the darkness. Planting dates, heat retention numbers, freeze thresholds, drainage timings, not encouragement. Inventory. The structure still existed, even if morale did not. Before sunrise the next morning, Holden walked alone to the enclosure, expecting to find everything dead. The first frame was gone. The second had frozen solid. The third collapsed inward beneath drifted snow. Then he reached the fourth frame near the lower stone curve beside the cliff. Inside, one miner's lettuce sprout still stood upright beneath the frosted muslin. Tiny, pale green, barely alive. Holden checked the thermometers with shaking hands. Inside the enclosure, 21 degrees. Outside the wall, -22. The margin was almost nothing, but it was enough. He lowered himself slowly into the snow beside the surviving sprout, while wind screamed across the frozen basin beyond the stone wall. By the final week of January, the enclosure stopped looking like an experiment and started looking like survival. Not abundance, survival. Miner's lettuce spread low across the warmest gravel sections nearest the cliff wall. Bitter mustard greens thickened slowly beneath the muslin frames. Frost beans climbed weakly along narrow supports, where trapped warmth lingered longest after sunset. Holden harvested carefully, only outer leaves. Never enough to weaken the roots beneath them. The first night, the 3 Mercers ate fresh greens inside the enclosure. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The lettuce tasted cold and sharp. The mustard carried bitterness strong enough to sting the tongue. But after months of beans, cornmeal, and salt pork, the flavor felt almost shocking. A day later, Holden carried a small wrapped bundle of greens to Amos Pike's smithy. Lucy Pike ate the first leaf slowly, while standing near the forge heat. Color returned to her face before she even finished chewing. Word spread through Red Hollow by evening. The next morning, Holden brought several bunches of mustard greens into the general store to trade for flour and lamp oil. Most people stared in silence before anyone spoke. Fresh green food in January did not belong in Montana territory. Caleb Dunn stood near the stove watching the leaves with narrowed eyes. He never laughed this time. Then one of the storekeepers bit into a mustard stem. The sound echoed sharply through the room. Crisp, fresh, real. Conversation stopped immediately. For several seconds, the only noise inside the store came from the wind rattling the front windows. Pastor Eli Cutter responded during Sunday's sermon the following morning. Pride, he warned the congregation, often disguises itself as cleverness. But the words no longer carried the same certainty they once had. People had now seen green leaves with their own eyes, while deep snow still covered the valley outside. The largest blizzard of the winter reached Red Hollow Basin 3 days after Holden Mercer noticed the pressure drop. The signs appeared early. Wind direction shifted twice in one afternoon. The air turned strangely still before sunset. Snowbirds vanished from the fence lines. Holden harvested every mature frame before the storm arrived. Then, winter hit the valley all at once. Fast. Hard. Fence posts disappeared beneath drifting snow before midnight. Freight wagons traveling from the southern routes vanished somewhere beyond the canyon roads. Cattle froze standing against broken windbreaks. Food stores across Red Hollow began shrinking faster than anyone wanted to admit. Inside the enclosure, the system fought for survival hour by hour. Near midnight, the trench water slowed dangerously beneath forming ice. One section of the western wall cracked sharply after freeze pressure shifted under the foundation stones. Holden and Elias pulled on heavy coats and forced themselves outside into the whiteout carrying shovels and lanterns. Wind slammed through the basin so hard, the lantern flame nearly vanished twice before they reached the trench line. Elias dropped to one knee beside the frozen channel, while ice formed across the fingers of her soaked gloves. She hacked loose-packed snow, while Holden broke ice from the overflow cut with the back of a trench blade. The water moved again just before dawn. Barely. But enough. By the second day of the storm, people started arriving at the stone gate. Lucy Pike came first, wrapped in blankets beneath Amos's coat, asking quietly if any greens remained. Later that evening, Caleb Dunn appeared with snow frozen across his beard. His youngest daughter had begun showing early signs of scurvy after weeks without fresh food. He could barely look Holden in the eye while speaking. Holden gave him mustard greens anyway. Then came the final knock. Pastor Eli Cutter stood outside the enclosure gate deep into the night while snow blew sideways across the basin. His son burned with fever back at the cabin. The pastor's face looked older than Holden remembered. For a moment, neither man spoke. Months earlier, Cutter had warned the entire town about pride disguised as cleverness. Now he stood in front of a stone wall, during the worst storm of the winter, asking for vegetables. The blizzard roared across Red Hollow Basin like an animal trying to tear the valley apart. But the footprints in the snow all led to the same place. When the storm passed, Red Hollow looked like a buried world. Fences and trails had vanished, leaving only a white silence. But the Mercer enclosure had held firm. The water in the trench still flowed, and beneath the frosted muslin, green leaves still pushed upward. The real story, however, wasn't inside the walls. It was etched in the snow outside. Dozens of footprints, beaten into a makeshift path, all led to one place, their stone gate. The tracks of Amos Pike, of Caleb Dunn, of Pastor Cutter. The entire valley had been forced to carve a new path through the snow, just to find its way to their small pocket of warmth. Standing atop the curved wall, Holden looked down at the undeniable proof. Winter wasn't over, but the battle for Red Hollow was decided. Now, they had to prepare for spring. Spring arrived late again the following year, but the problem waiting for Red Hollow Basin did not come from snow. It came from the supply routes. Freight teams traveling north brought word that seed blight had destroyed much of the region's spring stock farther south. Several settlements were already rationing what little remained. Prices tripled within weeks. For the first time since the basin was settled, Red Hollow faced the possibility of entering planting season without enough viable seed to survive the year. 3 days later, Benedict Shaw walked to the Mercer homestead through wet thaw mud instead of arriving on horseback. That detail mattered. Men rode when they intended to speak from authority. They walked when they came looking for answers. Inside the cabin, Holden opened the leather ledger across the table. Heat logs, freeze records, planting depths, seed-saving notes, germination timings beneath different gravel temperatures. Beside him, Miriam uncovered trays filled with early starts growing inside shallow stone beds near the enclosure wall. Miner's lettuce, cold mustard, frost bean seedlings already hardened against late freezes. Benedict Shaw studied the pages for a long time without speaking. Then his eyes moved toward the curved enclosure beyond the cabin window, where snow still lingered outside the wall, while green rose remained alive within it. That was the moment he understood the true scale of what Holden Mercer had built. Not simply a surviving homestead, a cold-season agricultural system capable of keeping seed alive through Montana winter. The change spread slowly after that, then everywhere at once. By midsummer, curved stone wind walls appeared beside small gardens across the valley outskirts. Muslin-growing frames rose behind cabins that had once mocked the idea openly. Gravel beds, fed by narrow trench channels, began showing up near livestock sheds and creek banks. Even Caleb Dunn built a half-circle stone barrier behind his horse barn before the next winter arrived. Pastor Eli Cutter delivered a different sermon that autumn. This time, he spoke about wisdom proven through endurance. Holden Mercer never celebrated any of it. No speeches followed, no town ceremony, no grand declaration. Each evening, he simply continued writing inside the leather ledger, while the enclosure gathered warmth behind the cabin. Stone, heat, seeds, failures, adjustments, knowledge surviving winter. And across Red Hollow Basin, more walls now curved quietly toward the southeastern sun, while the final snow of spring melted first along the warmed sandstone edges. And looking back at Red Hollow Basin, do you think Holden Mercer was truly farming vegetables? Or was he really learning how to trap summer itself inside stone?